Good morning. Good to see you guys all here this morning. We are going to start this week at the exact same place that we started last week. So Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Don't worry, it's a different sermon, all right? I've often wondered if I could get away preaching the same sermon a couple weeks in a row. And I imagine in that scenario, someone might come up to me and say, hey, David, that was the same sermon as you preached last week. To which I would probably respond, yes, and I'm going to continue to preach it until you start to live it. But I will resist that temptation, all right? However, we are back in Romans 12, verse 1 that says, therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Remember, we said last week that because of everything that God has done for us through Jesus, the only appropriate response for us is to live our lives in a way that is acceptable and pleasing to Him. And how do we do that? Verse 2, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. Last week, we drilled down on that phrase, do not be conformed. And we said that as Christ followers, we are to be different. We're to look different, talk different, speak differently. Our attitude should be different than the attitudes of the world. We should not be conformed. And when that comes to politics, that means that we politic differently. Now, the second half of the verse says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So this morning, we're going to talk about our mind, what we think about, how we process things, how we gain understanding, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. Remember that word discern. We'll come back to it. The will of God, we can understand that in a couple of different ways. One way is to think of the will of God as God's plan. So even before creation, before the dawn of time, God had a plan. His plan included you. His plan included me. His plan included Jesus and the plan of salvation. That's why we can have confidence that He who began a good work will be faithful to complete it, because God has a plan and His plan is never derailed. Another way that we can understand the will of God, and I think this is how Paul means it here, is as God's prescription. So God tells us the best way for us to live. He tells us what is good for us to do, and He also tells us what is not so good. And the reality is that when we follow His prescription, life goes as it should, but when we don't, it doesn't. And more often than not, we don't. Think back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were given a prescription from God. He said, you may freely eat from all of the trees in the garden, so this is what's good for you. He said, but there's this one tree over here, don't eat from this tree, that's what's bad for you. And of course, Adam and Eve, as we do, chose wrongly. They choose to do what God told them not to do, and it turned out badly for them. So what is God's prescriptive will for us? Well, Jesus made it really simple. He said, here it is, love God with all of your being, right? Your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love God with everything that you have, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's His will. And the truth is, when we live this way, what we discover is that life can be full of peace, it can be full of joy, it can be full of contentment. But God's prescription for our life looks very differently than the world's prescription for our life. You see, the world's prescription for our life isn't love God with all that you have, it's love yourself with everything that you have. Right? Put yourself first. Follow your dreams. Live your passion. You be you. Do whatever you want to do. Chase whatever you want to chase. Love yourself above all else, right? Whitney Houston sang a song like this. The greatest love of all is learning to love myself. Great voice, terrible theologian. Okay? That's just a terrible song, because that is not the greatest love. The greatest love is love of God and love of neighbor. Now, the world also says, God says, love your neighbor as yourself. The world says, love your neighbor if it works, right? So if your neighbor's the right kind of person, right? If you like your neighbor, if it's not going to cost you to love your neighbor, after you love yourself, then you can love your neighbor, but really only if it works. And here's the problem. Following God's prescription leads to peace, joy, contentment, all those kinds of fruit. But when we follow the world's prescription to love ourselves first, to love our neighbor if it works, what we discover is a life full of conflict. Because see, if you're loving yourself first, and I'm loving myself first, then our love for ourselves is going to come into conflict with each other, because sometimes you want things for you that are not good for me, and sometimes I want things for me that are not good for you. And so this philosophy leads to conflict. It leads to chaos. This idea that I love my neighbor if it works leads to anxiety, because I'm always wondering if it works or not. Should I love that person? Should I not love? Is that a good person? Is that a bad person? Because I can only love the good people. I can't love the bad people. Is that a person that society approves of or doesn't approve of? Is that a person that my family approves of or doesn't approve of? And I'm always wondering, is this a neighbor I should love or is this not a neighbor I should love? I don't know how to fit in. And it leads us to this place of anxiety and stress, depression, trying to figure out whether or not we should love our neighbor. And beyond that, living for myself first, loving my neighbor only if it's convenient, leads me to this place of guilt and despair and shame. Because here's the thing. The world says, love yourself above all else. But I know myself better than the world knows me. And I know what is in me more than the world knows what is in me. And I know that what is in me is this darkness that the world doesn't know about that makes it hard for me to love myself. Because when I try to love myself, I see myself for who I am. And when I see myself for who I am, I don't really feel like I'm all that lovable, and so I don't want to love myself. And the world says you should love yourself, but I don't love myself because I know myself. And so now I feel guilty because I'm not loving myself. And I struggle with this guilt and this despair and this shame. You see, that's why God's way is so much better. God doesn't say love yourself first. He says love me first. Love your neighbors second. And then he says, now, then maybe you love yourself, but the Bible actually never says love yourself. But here's the point. I can learn to love myself not because of who I am, not because of what I've done, but because of who Jesus is and what he's done in me and what he's done for me, and because he's given me the Holy Spirit. And because the Holy Spirit is in me, I love that, and so I can love me because of him, but not because of me. You see, following God's plan, his will, is infinitely better for me than following the world's prescription for my life. And that's what Paul is getting at here. He's saying, look, don't be conformed to this age, but instead let your mind be changed, transformed. Let your mind be changed so that you can become a discerning person who understands the will of God. And the will of God is what? To love God and to love my neighbor. So I'm going to make this really practical like we did last week. So right now, today, in 2024, Christ followers living in America, what does it look like for us to discern how to love God and love our neighbors? Here's the reality. If I want to politic differently, because that's what we said last week, we politic differently. If we are to politic differently, then we must discern how to love God and how to love our neighbor, especially in an election season. Because let's be honest, in an election season, it can be very difficult to love our neighbor, especially if they've got the wrong sign in their yard. And it can be very difficult to show our love to God because we get so wrapped up in all the other stuff. So how can we be more discerning? Well, when I hear the word discernment, I often think of the word wisdom because they're very closely tied together. And when I think of the word wisdom, I think of Proverbs because I love the book of Proverbs. Many of you know that I try to read a proverb a day, and it corresponds to the day of the month. So today is September. You guys aren't sure. Rough night last night, eh? Let's try that again. Today is September. So we're going to look at Proverbs. Yeah, good. See, you guys figured that one out. All right, good. So we're going to look at Proverbs 15 and see if there's any wisdom here for us today that can help us discern God's will, how to love him, how to love our neighbor. Let's start with verse 1. A gentle answer turns away anger, but a harsh word stirs up wrath. This is a great start, all right? Because we live in a time right now when there's a lot of conversations going on that sometimes become a little bit heated. This is a great reminder to us that our words carry power. The things you say matter because your words can either build someone up or they can tear someone down. And the proverb says, look, a gentle answer turns away anger. If you want to de-escalate you need to have a gentle answer. A harsh word just brings more heat and less light. In an election season, one of the things that you want to do is you want to convince other people. You want to convince them to see things your way, to vote your way, to act your way. And there's nothing wrong with that, but understand that what this proverb is telling us is just like the old saying, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. I'm not saying that your friends are insects. I'm saying that honey is better than vinegar, right? Gentle words are better than harsh words. Look at the next verse. The tongue of the wise makes knowledge attractive. This is the same principle, right? Use your words in a way that's attractive. But the mouth of fools blurts out foolishness. Can we agree that there is a lot of blurting going on these days? It's kind of a fun word to say, so I'm just going to stay here for a second. If you look it up in Webster's dictionary, the word blurt actually means to say suddenly and without thinking. And I think we see people doing that a lot, and I think maybe sometimes we have a tendency to do that, right? I'm just going to say something, and then after I say it, I'm like, oh, maybe that wasn't the best way to say that, or maybe I shouldn't have said that at all. And so the simple wisdom of this Proverbs is don't be a blurter, right? Maybe you didn't expect to hear me say that in church today, but don't be a blurter. Somebody make a t-shirt. That's a great t-shirt. Don't blurt, all right? Let's go to verse 14, all right? Here's where I really want to spend most of our time this morning, is in Proverbs 15:14, where it says, a discerning mind. So there's those words again, very similar to Romans 12:2. A discerning mind seeks knowledge, but the mouth of fools feeds on foolishness. Now, when you read Proverbs, almost all of the verses in Proverbs, not all of them, but almost all of them, are written what you might call like a couplet. And so there's two lines. And the first line and the second line usually are either parallel or they're a contrast to each other. When they're parallel, it just means that the two lines say the same thing, just with different words. And when they contrast each other, it means that the two lines are saying different things, but lead us to the same conclusion. And so in Proverbs, if I take the two lines and I compare them to each other, it gives me a really good sense of what the author is trying to say to me. So this morning, I want to show you 4 contrasts in this verse that can really help us understand what Solomon is getting at. All right? So the first contrast is the discerning person versus the fool. To discern is to understand or to perceive, to be able to accurately judge something. And the discerning person, who's also maybe sometimes called the wise person, is able to do this. They can understand and perceive, and they can get to a place of good judgment. And then there are some people who are called the fool. They have no discernment. They can't figure things out. They go through life kind of clueless. And of course, most of us, I think all of us would say, I want to be the discerning person, not the fool. And so as we read this verse, we've got to say, okay, so what does this say about the discerning person? What does this say about the fool? The second contrast here is mind versus mouth. I really like this one. All right, I'm going to give you some wisdom right now that could change your life. Okay? And for some of you, if you'll heed this wisdom, it will change your family's life as well. Are you ready? Here it is. You don't have to say everything you think. Okay, don't say amen. Don't hit the person next to you. That's blurting. Okay? You don't have to say everything you think. Sometimes it's okay to think about something before you say it. There's an Irish proverb that I just love. It says, taste your words before you spit them out. Isn't that good? Like, taste your words before you spit them out. Take that home, chew on it for a little bit. I don't know. You guys didn't respond as well as the second service. They really liked that one. I don't know. You guys seem a little down today. Did we run out of donuts? Do we need to pass out some sugar or something? All right, here we go. Third comparison. Seeks versus feeds, right after I talk about donuts. All right, seeks versus feeds. These are two words. One is an action word, and one is an apathetic word. Okay? To seek something means you're taking action. You're going after it. You're on a quest, right? You're searching for something. Whereas feeding is more of this kind of, I'm just passively opening my mouth and just letting you spoon feed me whatever you want. The idea here is the discerning person, the wise person, they seek for something. Whereas the fool, they just kind of sit and open their mouth, and whatever you give them, they're going to mindlessly swallow. They're just going to take it, whatever it is. This is where we talk about someone being spoon-fed information, right? They only have one place to get their information, and they just swallow whatever you tell them. There's no discernment at all. And that really brings us to the fourth contrast, which is knowledge versus foolishness. And if we put it into today's vernacular, we would say this maybe is truth versus fake news. And understand how this all fits together now, right? The discerning person elevates mind over mouth. So they don't just say whatever comes to mind. But the reason they do that is because they want to be discerning and they want to seek out the truth. So they are actively looking for truth. Whereas the fool, their mouth is open all the time. They're either saying things they shouldn't or they're feeding on things they shouldn't. And now for Solomon, I think he would have said, if he spoke English, and he didn't, but if he spoke English, he would have said probably the same thing as Mr. T here. He would have said, I pity the fool. Right? And of course, we also pity the fool, but we also don't want to be the fool. So let me give you three kind of general principles from this verse that help us to not be the fool. Right? The first one is this. Use your mind more than your mouth. Right? Use your mind more than your mouth. James talks about this in James chapter 1. He says, my dear brothers and sisters, understand this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. You say, look, if you really want to be discerning, you start by closing your mouth. Right? Close your mouth. Why? So you can listen. And this listening is more than just being quiet while someone else talks. It means you're listening to understand. You're trying to figure out, to perceive what it is that they're saying. Stephen Covey said, listen to understand, not to respond. How often do you listen to someone, but your mind is already going over what you're going to say back to them? That's not listening. That's just pre-planned blurting. Okay? And so James says, look, be quick to listen, close your mouth, open your ears, open your mind, try to understand. So use your mind more than your mouth. Second, really general principle out of Proverbs 15:14 is this. Study more than you scroll. Study more than you... It's so easy to scroll, isn't it? Like if you want to scroll social media or you're just kind of scrolling news feed or whatever it is, it's so easy. In fact, it only takes like one muscle, your thumb muscle, right? That's all you need to scroll. Now, I don't have any scientific backing for this. It's just a hypothesis. But if you ever think about this, if you actually turn a page in a book, remember those? If you turn a page in a book, you actually have to use your fingers, use your hand. You have to even use your arm and your elbow to turn that. So I'm pretty sure that people who read books are in better shape than people who scroll because they're using more muscles. No, seriously though, it's important for us to study more than you scroll. So maybe start here. Read something that's longer than one paragraph. I don't know what it might be, but read something that's longer than one paragraph. Maybe turn the computer off, shut the phone down, turn the television off. Study something. Maybe say, you know what, I'm going to use some of my spare time. I'm going to do a research project. I don't know what I'm going to study, but I'm going to find something that I enjoy, and I'm going to kind of research it. I'm going to learn about it. I'm going to exercise my mind. Maybe this means having conversations with people you disagree with. Maybe it's just as simple as getting into a group of people where you can do a Bible study together. Just doing anything to exercise your mind, to seek truth instead of mindlessly consuming what the world is trying to pour into you. And that brings us to our third general principle, which is this. Recognize the difference between God's truth and the world's foolishness. 1 Corinthians 1 has this great verse that says that God's foolishness is still wiser than the world's wisdom. The world wants to pour their wisdom, which is actually foolishness, into you. That's why Paul says in Romans 12, don't be conformed to that, but be transformed. Change your mind. Get away from that. Renew your mind so that you can discern. And what Proverbs is telling us is a discerning person seeks out knowledge instead of just mindlessly opening their mouth and swallowing whatever they're told. And so we're going to spend the rest of this morning talking about how to do that. But let me give you a little bit of a disclaimer here, okay? Normally, when we're here on a Sunday morning and I'm preaching, normally about 2/3 of the sermon is spent with me saying, here's what God has said. So we're looking at the Bible, we're trying to figure out what it means, what it says, what the author was trying to communicate. Here's what God has said. And then usually near the end of the sermon, I'll say, okay, now here's some practical application for us. And if you've been coming here a while, you know this. And for some of you, when you hear me say practical application, you get excited because you're like, good, he's almost done. We're about to do some practical application. I'm not close to done, okay? So it's not a time to be relieved. That'll come later, all right? But the reason I want to spend more time here this week is because I think it's hard for us to love God if we don't pursue truth, because God is a God of truth. And when we start to swallow the small lies of the world, we move further from the truth of God. This is what happened to Eve in the garden. Right? In the garden, Satan came to her, and he began with just a small lie. He says, look, Eve, if you will mindlessly consume this first lie, has God really said? Then I've got you hooked. And now we're just going to go bigger lie, bigger lie, bigger lie, until Eve, you can't even tell the truth anymore. That's what the evil one does. And so I think it's important for us, if we want to love God appropriately, we must be people who seek the truth, who want to know the truth. And if we want to love our neighbor as ourselves, we can't be lying to them. We can't be sending false information to them. So to love God is to pursue truth. To love neighbor is to not spread lies. And so I want to walk us through, I've got 7 kind of habits or practices or application steps, whatever you want to call them. I got 7 things, 7 bullet points that can help us discern the truth before we spread a lie. All right, here's the first one. Confirm and consider. It's really easy for us sometimes when we hear something or see something or read something that we agree with. It's very easy for us in those times to just simply accept it, right? Well, that I agree with that, so I accept it as truth. It must be true if I agree with it, right? The reality is sometimes there are things that we hear that we agree with them, but they're not true. And it's important for us, even if we agree with something, to go back and confirm it, to make sure it's true before we pass it on to someone else. Because if we pass it on to someone else after having mindlessly consumed it, now we're the person spreading the lie instead of discerning the truth. So it's important, even if I agree with something, to confirm that it is true. And we're going to talk more about how to do that in just a second. But the other side of that is also true. Because sometimes I will hear something, or I'll see something, or I'll read something, someone will say something to me, and I will disagree. And because I disagree, I automatically assume that it's false, right? Have you ever done this? Where you're like, well, I don't really like that, and so it must not be true. I'm reading a story, and I'm like, well, I don't like the implications of this. I don't like where this is going. I don't agree with it. It doesn't fit my preconceived notions, and so therefore it must be false. And what I have to be willing to do is I have to be willing to consider whether I'm dismissing this because I don't like it, or am I dismissing this because it's not true? So how do I do that? Well, let's keep going. Step number 2 is this. Don't believe the first report. Proverbs 18 says something similar to this. It says, a man seems right until he is cross-examined. And the idea being that the first story you hear is the one that seems most believable, but then you hear another story and you say, oh, I didn't have the whole story. Let me be honest with you. Most of the time in life, the first thing you hear is not the whole story, and it's often not the whole truth. And so one of the practices I have in my life is when a big news story breaks, right? Whether I like it or don't like it, whether I agree with it or don't agree with it, when I see something big, I almost always say, I need to wait. Before I draw any conclusions, before I form my opinions, before I pass this on to someone else, I need to wait so that I can get the whole story. Because I want to be a person who's seeking truth and who's passing truth. So don't believe the first report. Also cross-check references. So if you get all of your information from one source, then you are mindlessly consuming. That's the behavior of a fool. If I only ever listen to one source, so I turn on the TV, I get home, I turn on the TV, and I watch the same news station until I go to bed. I'm mindlessly consuming that. I am not getting the whole story because I'm only seeing the first report. The reality is what I need to do is I need to hear something and then I need to check it. So if I hear something from this source, I need to go and check it at this source over here. And here's what happens when I do that. If I hear a story here and check it here, I'm going to find there are some places the two stories completely agree. And that's where I can say, okay, this is probably true. And I'm going to say, there's also some really weird inconsistencies here, like they're saying this and they're saying this, that these don't match up at all. And that tells me I got to keep digging. So maybe I bring a third source in and say, how do I find out what the truth is here? If I want to seek the truth and I don't want to spread a lie, I've got to cross-check my references. Right now, our neighbors in Springfield are in the news a lot, right? A lot. And if you've been watching the news, you know that this is true. And so I've been watching. I'm aware of what's going on. You know, I've seen all the memes. I watched the debate. I've listened to the Reds and the Blues do all of their spin about what's going on in Springfield. But that's not enough for me. So what I've also done is I've gone and I've tried to read local news reports, like people who actually live in Springfield, who can say, this is what I'm seeing. Here's an eyewitness account. And I've even tried to listen to some friends that I have who live in Springfield and say, what are you seeing? What are you experiencing? And having checked all of those different references, I still don't think I have a full handle on what the actual, real, full, complete story is in Springfield, Ohio. But here's what I know. What I've learned is this is a complex, multifaceted issue. And it's one that probably none of us have a full grasp on. But what it is it's a story of human suffering. And it's human suffering that is wider and broader than anything we're hearing on the news. And it's the kind of difficulties that our government is woefully inept at solving. And that's why it keeps getting bigger and not smaller. And the reality is that whatever source you're looking to get your news about what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, you're not getting the whole picture. You're not seeing the whole story. And the truth is that whatever is going on there, this is about people who need to be shown the love of God. And so if I have an opportunity, rather than looking for something that's just going to give me an opportunity to beat up my political opponent, I ought to be saying, how can I help? What can I do to help here? How can I better understand the situation? How can I be someone who is empowering without enabling, right? These are all the questions that we as Christians should be asking instead of just saying, well, this narrative fits my side, so I'm going with this. And then I'm going to forward 100 emails to people saying, this is what I know about Springfield, Ohio. I need to check my sources, and until I am crystal clear that I know the truth, I shouldn't be passing it on to anybody, right? So check your references. Next thing is to question the intent of headlines. Did you know that headlines are not written to summarize the story? They haven't been forever, but even more so now. We crossed this line about a decade ago from print media to digital media. And now the way the whole digital media works is I get your money if you click on my headline. And so I want to write my headline in a way that's going to get you to click. And so almost every headline you see is written to evoke emotion in you. They want to make you mad. They want to get you angry. They want to make you suspicious. They want to put you in a place of fear because they want you to click. And this is kind of the dirty little secret of the news media. And by the way, this isn't new. Right? This has been going on for hundreds of years. You can go all the way back to the presidential election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and those two guys were leveraging the media then against each other. It was just newspaper then, but they were constantly using their two different newspapers to go after each other. Here's what a headline is intended to do. A headline is an effort to control you. It wants to evoke emotion in you so that you will be motivated to do what they want you to do. First and foremost, they want you to click on their story so they get their money. But then they want you to act the way they want you to act. They want you to do whatever it is that they want you to do. Whether it's think something, do something, vote a certain way, whatever it might be. The purpose of headlines is to control you by evoking emotion which will motivate you. So every time you read a headline, you need to ask yourself, what is the emotion I'm feeling right now, and why are they trying to make me feel this? This is how you maintain self-control, which is a fruit of the Spirit, as opposed to being controlled by someone else. Okay, so question the intent of headlines. And distinguish between observation and interpretation. Observation is telling the story. It's the who, the what, the when, the where, right? This is what happened. Interpretation is telling you what you should think about the story. And more often than not, in 2024, journalism is more interpretation than it is observation. And again, the reason is they want to influence you, they want to motivate you, they want to gain control over you. And so they're not anymore telling you, here's what happened. They're saying, here's what you need to think about what happened. So as you read a story, as you read a post, as you look at a meme, as you listen to the news, as you watch the news, as you have a conversation with somebody else, constantly be asking yourself, is this observation? Are they just telling me what happened? Or is this interpretation? Are they telling me what I ought to think? Because a person who wants to discern the truth, a person who wants to seek knowledge, will say, you know what? I hear that you're trying to tell me this, but I need to dig a little deeper. I need to check the sources, right? I need to not believe the first thing I hear. So know the difference between observation and interpretation. Now, this next one's going to seem a little bit weird, but stay with me. Ignore pictures. Okay? Ignore pictures. See, there's two big problems with pictures. The first is that a picture only shows you a moment in time. When you look at a picture, you have no way of knowing what happened before that picture or after that picture. And a picture is cropped exactly as the photographer wants it to be cropped. You can't see what's just outside the frame. And very often, you might see a picture that if you saw a little bit wider of a shot, it would change the meaning completely. Or you might see a picture where if you saw what happened right before or what happened right after, it might change the meaning completely. Now here's the reality. Very often, pictures are used to mislead us. I mean, how many times have you had someone share a picture with you and say, look at this picture, it proves my point, only to find out later that picture is not at all telling the truth of the story? Understand this, a picture can't prove anything because a picture only captures a moment in time. A picture can suggest something. A picture can maybe tell you what happened, but this brings us to the second problem with pictures, which is this. Pictures can be manipulated. They can be edited. AI can generate pictures. AI can edit pictures. And so now a picture doesn't help you at all in your search for truth. So don't look at pictures. Okay, you can look at pictures. Look at pictures of puppies and sunsets. Okay? That will make you happy. But when it comes to conversations and debates and trying to convince other people or trying to discover the truth, pictures are more often than not your friend. And the last one is kind of similar to that. Search for full-length video sources. Okay, I can't even believe I'm talking about this in church. But if we want to love God, we have to be seekers of truth. And if we want to love our neighbor, we can't be passing lies along. And the reality is more lies are passed with pictures and videos than any other way in our world today. Anytime you see a video clip, whether it's on social media, whether it's on a news broadcast, whether a friend sends you a link or some other video on your phone, anytime you see a video clip, you need to understand that video was edited for length and it was edited for content. No one ever shows you a video they don't want you to see. Every time someone gives you a video, it's because they want you to see what they want you to think. And so you have to ask yourself, just like in the picture, what happened before this video started? What happened after this video ended? Most of you will remember a kid named Nick Sandman. He's from our area, down in Cincinnati. And in 2019, he was at the March for Life in Washington, D.C., and had no idea he was going to get caught up in a national controversy. Because all of a sudden these pictures came out of him and these videos came out of him where it appeared that he was kind of this rude, brash, disrespectful teenager who was getting up in the face of other people. And I remember the first time I saw the pictures and the first time I saw the videos, my first thought was, man, that's a bad look. That kid's parents should have taught him better. He should be more respectful. And the first time Mary Ann saw it, she said to me, I think he's scared. I think he's confused. Now, obviously, my wife is a more gracious person than I am, but also we have a son who is of a similar age, and she said, the look on his face is the exact same look Liam gets on his face when he doesn't know what to do. So I thought, you know what, I need to look into this a little bit more. And one of the benefits of the internet is that we can go and we can find things. And so I did. And I found full-length videos, like hours of videos from the March for Life that day that I could watch, that showed everything that happened leading up to this incident, everything that happened after this incident, so I could gain a full understanding of what happened that day. And what I discovered was that my initial assumption was wrong, that there was a lot more going on than I had realized. That this kid probably actually wasn't this disrespectful, angry kid getting up in people's face, but he actually probably was confused and scared and found himself thrust into a situation that he didn't pursue. And I realized my assumptions were wrong because I didn't have the whole story. Now, I'm not saying don't ever watch video. What I am saying is before you share that video, before you pass that video along, make sure you understand the whole picture. Here's the thing. All of these things we're talking about this morning are helpful for us in a political season, and they are helpful for us all the time in our relationships. Because at the end of the day, all of these things come back to, what do I assume? What are the assumptions I'm making about what is and is not true? And sometimes I can make one bad assumption that leads me in a really bad direction. Imagine if someone came up to me after the first service on a Sunday and said, hey David, I need to tell you something. I don't know if you were aware of this, but Pastor Steve, he takes his Oreos and he dips them in orange juice before he eats them. That's disgusting. I can't imagine ruining a perfectly good Oreo like that. And I hear that and I'm like, boy, that just sounds terrible. And honestly, that makes me think that Steve probably has a really deep character flaw. Because only a person with a really deep character flaw would ruin a perfectly good Oreo by dipping it in orange juice. And so now I'm going through my day, and after the second service, somebody comes up to me and says, hey, David, I was just walking to the lobby, and I overheard a conversation, and I thought you should know about this. I overheard Steve say, the Detroit Lions are stupid. Now, I think to myself, that doesn't sound like Steve. I know he's a Browns fan, but he generally, says nice things about the Lions. He knows I like the Lions. That doesn't sound like something he says, but I discovered this morning that Steve has a very deep character flaw. And if Steve has a very deep character flaw, then it's very possible that he said this about the Lions, because only someone with a deep character flaw would say bad things about the Lions. So now do you see what's happening is I'm now operating on some assumptions. I'm operating on the assumption that Steve dips his Oreos in orange juice, and that reflects a deep character flaw. And that because of that deep character flaw, he talks bad about my football team. And then imagine at the end of the third service, somebody comes up to me and says, hey, David, I heard this about Steve, and it's really awful, and it's a terrible story. And I hear it, and whereas yesterday I would have quickly dismissed it, today I believe it. Because I've discovered today that Steve is a deeply flawed person who says terrible things and does terrible things. And so how could I ever trust him? Do you see what I've done here? What I've done is I've built this Jenga tower of assumptions, all based on one that may or may not be true. Because I believed the first thing I heard. Because I didn't check references. Because I didn't go back and try to get the whole picture. Now, by the way, I don't think Steve actually dips his Oreos in orange juice. I do think that might be a character flaw if he does. But imagine if I find out that he actually doesn't. Now I have to figure out, can I unwind everything else I believe about him? And it becomes very difficult to do that. Because now I want to protect myself. And I would say, well, I can't be wrong about everything, so maybe I was wrong about the orange juice, but I'm not wrong about him saying bad things. And maybe I was wrong about the orange juice, but I'm not wrong about him doing terrible things. Now, my assumptions are built on the wrong foundation. And so it's very likely that my assumptions are wrong. But it's very hard for me to unwind that when I start from one big, bad, faulty assumption. This is why truth matters. This is why it matters that we seek discernment, that we go after the truth. Because when we don't, we have the potential of putting cracks in our relationships, of bringing conflict into our relationships, of bringing chaos into our relationships, because we believe things that aren't true because we didn't do the work to find out. Let me finish with one more piece of wisdom from the book of James. This is James chapter 1. It says, "Now if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly." There's really two actions here in this verse. Right? If you want wisdom, number one, you need to go to the Bible. You see what it says here is that God gives generously. One of the things that God has given to us, one of his great gifts to us is his word. It's where he reveals to us everything we need to know to live in this world. And if I want to know the will of God, if I want to know the wisdom of God, I have to go to his word. I can't fully explain how this works, but I know it does. That somehow the Holy Spirit operates in my life when I spend time in God's word. What I have discovered in my life is in those times when I am habitually reading God's word every day, when I'm making time, when I'm making room for it, what I discover is that his word speaks extraordinarily practically to what happens in my life. I'll be going through a day, something will come my way, and I'll say, oh my word, that's exactly what I read this morning. I know exactly how to behave in this situation because of the wisdom of God. And I can't explain it, but it happens, and I know many of you can confirm that this is true for you. If I want the wisdom of God, I need to go to God's word. But also notice it says here, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask. So if I want the wisdom of God, I need to pray for the wisdom of God. We are in a time right now where we need an extraordinary amount of discernment and an extraordinary amount of wisdom. And so we ought to every day be bathing ourselves, be bathing our lives, be bathing this election season in prayer. Simply asking that God would open our eyes, that he would help us to consider, to take the time to seek the truth, to not be led astray by just the first thing we come along, but rather to compare it to what he says and to what the truth actually is. We ought to be taking time every day to pray for ourselves and to pray for those around us.